Hello everyone and welcome to Past, Present, and Occult. This is Emiliano Noriega Petty. In this week's episode I'll be exploring what is Freemasonry and where exactly does it come from. So what is Freemasonry? Well, the answer will vary depending on who you ask, so let's start with this basic definition here that most scholars or people who are in a Masonic studies program will come across. Simply put, Freemasonry is a fraternal organization or a set of fraternal organizations that can trace its roots to the local Guild of Stonemasons from around the 14th century in medieval or Dark Age Europe. You might be wondering why this definition is so European and why they picked the 14th century as their starting point. Well, let me try to give you some background on both of those things. Freemasonry is ultimately a European invention in terms of its modern manifestation. It is ultimately invented, or at least it comes to its fullest exemplification within the United Kingdom within the year 1717 when the Grand Lodge is founded there. I do keep using the word invention, and I do need to address that because by invention, I don't mean that some guy or a group of guys sat down and came up with masonry out of nowhere. What I mean is that the way it looks now, the modern rituals, those came to a particular point and were invented or created, you could even say refined, in the year 1717, at least within the United Kingdom. But is that all Masonry is? Is it just the outgrowth of regular Freemasonry or operative Freemasonry into the speculative branch? The first way to answer that question is with yes. That's because modern Freemasonry very much exists because operative Freemasonry, which is to say Masons who actually build buildings, was eventually transitioned into speculative Freemasonry, which is the Masonry that is just defined by its rituals and its particular association of people all over the world, like what we have now. So yes, Freemasonry exists because this transition occurred. However, is that the only reason that Freemasonry exists at all? And the answer is no. Freemasonry is much older than the Grand Lodge of England, and this is obvious because you can't have a Grand Lodge until you've had a number of local lodges for a greater period of time. But how old is it exactly, and does it extend any further than the 14th century? My answer is yes, it does, if we look at it in a different way than just saying the tradition is this particular set of rituals. The reason that most scholars will date the emergence of Freemasonry to the stone guilds of the 14th century is that is the earliest that they can find evidence of these stonemason guilds making use of passwords and particular secret handshakes. Before I go into my theory on the matter, I just want to point out two things. The lack of evidence doesn't mean it definitely didn't happen at all. Second, there is obvious proof that stonemasonry has existed for a very long period of time, in fact, much longer than simply dating it to the 14th century. So let's look at how far back we can go with that. Well, based on the archaeological record, we can tell that stonemasonry would have existed at the exact same time that any of the great cities would have been built. The oldest of these settlements can be dated to roughly 10,000 BC or 12,000 years ago. This shows that stonemasonry as a skill would have existed at this time, so stonemasonry is at least 12,000 years old within human history. Now that we have this maximum date for the existence of stonemasonry, let's ask another question. Could these stonemasons have in any way been similar to Freemasons? Here are some things that I want you to consider before I answer the question. Anybody with this skill would have been very well paid and powerful because of the fact that they could do something extremely useful within this time period. In fact, from Mesopotamia to Egypt or Europe, a stonemason would have been the literal builder of society because that was what they were making their civilizations out of at this time. They were predominantly using stone, especially within Egypt and the Fertile Crescent where civilization first begins. Now, when I say the stonemasons were building the civilizations that they were a part of, I don't just mean that they were making a large amount of the structures within those societies. I also mean that they were responsible for making the most important ones within those societies. If you consider the Romans, Egyptians, Mesopotamians, or anybody else who's living at this time, you can clearly see that the most important structures within their societies are built out of stone. So what does that mean about the stonemasons who are making them? Well, it implies that they must have an incredible level of access to all levels of their society because you must be able to get into the palace to build it, and you must be allowed into the presence of the gods in order to build their temples. Consider this also, now that I brought that up. Most people people within the society would have not been allowed into the palace or into any of their religious structures at all because they were not royalty or part of the priesthood. Yet the stonemasons within the society would have been allowed to access all parts of this building as part of building it. In Freemasonry, this is echoed within the Scottish Rite and similar extra bodies of Freemasonry, where you have degrees that combine the idea of a king, a builder, and further degrees in priesthoods, and the idea here being that a person would have needed to somehow have had all of these authorities in order to build the spaces that they're then interacting with. Now you might be saying, where am I getting this idea from? Well, it comes from the Old Testament in particular and the building of King Solomon's temple. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to Freemasonry. You see, the reason for this is all of the parts of the temple that were within the main temple space itself were reserved to a group of Levites who are called the sons of Aaron, Aaron being the first high priest of the Jewish people. God makes it very clear that only these people are allowed to go within the temple and its boundaries. However, he also makes it very clear that the sacred space exists even before the building of the entire location, and let me explain how that works. In Judaism, something becomes sacred, or particularly a space becomes sacred, because God makes it so, not because a man builds a building. Therefore, the place that's considered the Holy of Holies is always the Holy of Holies. It doesn't matter if the building's there or not. In fact, this belief is so big within Judaism that today it's one of the reasons that Jews are forbidden to go onto the Temple Mount in Israel, because, oh my gosh, what if you step into this incredibly holy space that you are forbidden from entering into? See, the Jewish religion takes the idea of sacred space so intensely in this particular way that the space was already holy before the temple had been built, which means that not only would the sons of Aaron need some sort of special rituals and allowances to enter these spaces, it would also require the builders to have the same allowances. These builders, would need the ability, would need the rituals, would need whatever the permission was from the higher power that be to enter this area, otherwise the temple of God could not have been built. So what do we as Freemasons understand from that, and what is ultimately my answer to the question? Were these stonemasons in any way similar to Freemasonry or Freemasons as they exist today? And my answer is yes, when you consider the number of allowances they would have had to have had and the connections that they would have maintained and grown. One thing that defines a Freemason is right in the title, that he is free. And what is the particular freedom that a Freemason claims to have now and then? Well, it's the freedom to move upon the earth as he sees fit without needing anyone's permission, and to work wherever he sees fit as well. Now, that doesn't sound super impressive until you remember how incredibly restricted movement was in the ancient world and still is in parts of the modern world. Furthermore, most people couldn't choose their professions at all in the ancient world, so the ability to choose where you worked and to decide your own wages and to bargain with somebody was quite an impressive power. Let me explain that a little more. Masons of old had a very unique skill. They could build you the church, they could build you a castle, a keep, whatever you wanted. You couldn't do that no matter how hard you tried or yelled at them or threatened them. They could only do that if they wanted to. This was for two main reasons. The Masons had unique skills that couldn't simply be taught to another person very quickly, and they were known to each other well enough that if somebody was mistreating a Mason in this part of the world, other Masons would hear about it and probably not go over there to work, which would not be very beneficial to that leader. Finally, here's actually a third reason. Because of all of these other powers that Masons had through their connections and their skill, they had the unique ability to look a king in the eye and say, this is how much you're going to pay me if you want me to do this for you, and very few other people could do that. Oh yes, there were some mercenary groups, there were some bishops, there were some other people, so on and so forth, but all Master Masons could make this particular demand of a king if that king intended to employ him for his services. Because of all of this, I definitely feel comfortable saying yes, that they were comparable groups of people. Now we just have to answer another question. Did this older group of stonemasons have rituals and degrees? Sadly, I don't know what their initiation ceremonies would have looked like if they had any at all, but we do know that they had 3 levels of entrance or 3 levels of membership. They did have an apprentice degree, a journeyman degree, and a master degree, or at least a rank if you want to call it that and not a degree. Could they have somehow marked this particular membership? Yes, they could have, but we don't have any clear evidence that they did one way or the other. However, Freemasonry doesn't just claim to be a continuation of the stonemason guilds, it also claims to be a continuation of the mystery schools and traditions of old. if not in a literal sense, then at least a spiritual one. Freemasonry does claim to teach its initiates various secrets or truths about the way that the world works, and it does that through initiation, which is definitely modeled after the mystery schools of Greece and the ancient world, at least in some capacity. The reason that I have to say in some capacity is these old mystery schools did a fantastic job of hiding their secrets. We don't know what the secret of Eleusis is, or what the Mithraians actually found out during their highest ceremony. We just know that it existed. Similarly, Masonry has tried and not ultimately succeeded, because if you really want to, there are plenty of files online to keep its secrets. The reason that we keep our secrets in the way that we do is tied to the idea that initiation is important, and the reason that we think initiation is particularly sacred, spiritual, and meaningful comes from the reasons that these old mystery schools thought it was as well. Now, let me make something very clear here. Our secrets are not necessarily information that you have never heard before in your entire life, and that's not necessarily the point of the initiation or the secrecy. You see, one of the ideas behind initiation isn't that we're necessarily going to tell you something that you've never heard before. Instead, what initiation does is it takes you out of the normal space that you're always in two ways. The first way that it does that is it literally removes you from the same space that you're usually in and puts you in a lodge room to have the ritual take place, and then mentally it removes you from the mind space that you're in most of the time. Doing this creates what I like to call a sacred moment, or a particularly meaningful moment in which you can be told or you can experience something in a way that makes it life-changing. Let me try to give you an example that hits that home. I think I've used this example before on this channel, but it goes like this. Imagine you had somebody that you really loved and you were going to reveal it to them and propose to them in this incredibly meaningful way. It doesn't have to be big, it just has to be super meaningful, okay? Now, the question to you is, no matter what you were going to do that was super meaningful, would it be as meaningful if the person you were going to do it to found out about it before you did it? My answer is no, at least in a small way, and that's because sometimes the only way that you can truly appreciate something is to experience it naturally in the moment, and by that I mean sort of by surprise. The reason that I think that matters is human attention works in very funny ways, and when we're paying attention to something that we're expecting, it's different than when we pay attention to something that's surprising to us. Because if we don't know what's coming next, we have a tendency to keep paying attention to what's happening, because again, since we don't know what's happening, there's that instinctive part of the human mind that goes, hey, you really need to focus because you never know if this could go badly. Not that it's going to when you're being initiated, but that part of the human psyche that pays more attention to something it's unfamiliar with is what initiation is trying to take advantage of. A simpler way to say all of that is we tend to notice something when it comes as a real event than when it comes as something that's scripted, boring, or that can be ignored in one way or another. Masonic ritual does all of this when performed correctly for the candidate, and this is what a Masonic lodge is really about. It's about being able to perform this ritual consistently and well for candidates so that Masonry continues on and on. That's obviously not all a lodge does, but that's what it does to continue on from year to year and generation to generation. Now, I've talked about our ritual for a bit, so what exactly do I mean when I say Masonic ritual? Well, Masonic ritual includes anything that I can't really talk about, so I'm going to do my best to not give it away while still giving you a meaningful introduction here. In short, I could classify rituals into two basic categories, and those are rituals for initiation and rituals for getting stuff done. The rituals for initiation include the 3 degrees of Freemasonry, which are Entered Apprentice, Fellow Craft, and Master Mason. The rituals for getting stuff done include a list of the following. When it comes to getting stuff done, the 2 things that we do most often and consistently are our stated meetings and funerals. The funerals happen to be open to the public, so let me talk about them for a little bit. A Masonic funeral is what it sounds like. It's a funeral for a Freemason. However, it is a chance for people who are not Masons to see a Masonic ritual for their loved one. The purpose of the service is to act as a final sending off for a departed brother, and it's a very beautiful ceremony that if you ever have a chance to attend, I'd encourage you to do. A stated meeting, however, is something that you can't go to unless you're at least a entry-level member in most jurisdictions. It is, however, very much what it sounds like. It's the monthly meeting where any organization, regardless of how secretive or open, takes care of the basic business of running the organization. Some people find them extremely boring for this particular reason. These two rituals are not the ones that most people come to Masonry for. In fact, they're usually ones that people find out about later or have to deal with later in the course of their Masonic career. The reason most people come to Freemasonry is because of our 3 ritual degrees. Now, what can I say about these degrees without giving a lot of it away? Well, what I can say is that they are obviously based off of the building of King Solomon's temple. They incorporate characters from the building of that temple, and then they tell a particular story or legend about them. One of the main purposes of these degrees is to teach particularly Masonic lessons. One of them is about what we call the 3 graces within Freemasonry. The 3 graces are faith, hope, and charity, and the way that Masons are told to interpret them functions slightly differently than, let's say, the modern world tends to look at these 3 concepts. Starting with faith, since Freemasonry is not a religion, we don't preach faith in a particular god or philosophy, but we do believe that all people should be good followers of their particular religion. Furthermore, we believe that people should have faith in each other and should work to foster a spirit of goodwill within the world in the same way that most religions ask their followers to do. In terms of hope, we are called upon not only to have hope in ourselves, but hope in creating a better world through what we practice. Finally, in regards to charity, Freemasonry actively practices this, and most lodges have some sort of pet charity that not only they participate in, but their Grand Lodge actively encourages them to do so as well. If you happen to like the sound of all of this and you're thinking, well, how do I join? Luckily for you, it's not too difficult, at least if you're in the UK or United States. I can't speak for the rest of the world. I haven't been everywhere yet. Here's what you have to do. You don't have to email me, you don't have to ask me anything at all. All you have to do is look for your nearest Masonic lodge, attend an event for the public, and just make an effort to do that for about a year or half a year. You'll eventually be allowed to ask. Yes, you have to ask for an application, and then you go from there and hopefully you get in. That's really all it takes. You don't have to be the Sultan of Brunei, not that it would hurt, but you really can be any particular person so long as you're a decent human being and make the effort to show up consistently, regularly, and not be too weird. Moving on from all of that, why do we happen to find King Solomon so incredibly interesting, given the fact that we could have chosen anybody else not only in the Bible, but all of history if we were really going to be non-religiously specific? Well, the reason is twofold. The people who originally, I think, founded Freemasonry, especially how it looks in the modern world, were most likely Christians, and that influenced their choice. They may have also picked King Solomon because, as was often the case during the time that the grimoires were being written or other occult/esoteric books or works were being written, basically anything the church didn't want you to write, a lot of people attributed these works to King Solomon because it was a lot easier to say, oh, King Solomon once wrote or King Solomon once said, than, oh, I think or I believe, because that could get you in trouble through an accusation of heresy or blasphemy. The reason Solomon may have been a safe person to attribute ideas/new ideas to is because of the fact that he was Jewish, and a little bit of anti-Semitism may have played into this because of the fact that some people might have gone, oh, well, of course he made a mistake or was wrong, he was Jewish. I'm not saying that that was a positive thing, I'm just saying that perhaps that was one of the reasons why putting words into his mouth was a safer thing to do than claiming them as your own. Solomon might have also been chosen simply because there were many legends about him, including in the Quran, that attributed amazing feats to him. For example, in the Quran, one of the things that they say about him there is that he specifically used demons to craft his temple and that he was able to subjugate them using a copper ring. Anybody who is familiar with the Lesser Key of Solomon, which is a grimoire that tells you how to bind demons, will find this very interesting because that book says, oh yeah, you should basically do something very similar if you want to bind the same demons that Solomon used. My final thoughts on our reason for fixating on King Solomon could also do with the fact that Christendom during the Crusades made an active attempt to not only occupy Jerusalem, but the Temple Mount. The Knights Templar, in which there is also a Masonic connection, were particularly fascinated by this area and were doing a lot of archaeology there. Their findings, whether accurate or not, heavily influenced the Western world when it came to their fixation on the Temple of Solomon. Now that I've brought it up, what is the connection, if any, between the Knights Templar of old and the Knights Templar or Commandery that can be found within modern Freemasonry? The old order of Knights Templar, or the Order of the Knights of Christ, poor Knights of Christ in particular, they wanted to be poor, and that's interesting because they founded what we can consider modern-day banking, were a Catholic religious order. One of the main things that they tasked themselves with, and ultimately that they were officially tasked with by the Pope, was protecting pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land. They did this not only by guarding them on the way there, but by allowing them to deposit money with the order while they were in Europe, and from there they could pick it up once they had reached the Holy Land using a receipt. Ultimately, most scholars now agree that it was the incredible amount of money that they amassed through this banking venture that caused the Pope and French king to turn on the Knights Templar and burn them at the stake on Friday the 13th in the year 1314. How then did this group that was ultimately accused of heresy become involved with Freemasonry at all? Well, here's how it might have happened. Although it can be very easy to forget this, England wasn't always Protestant and the way it is now. In fact, it was one of the most heavily Catholic nations in all of Europe for an incredibly long time. Because of this, it was one of the headquarters of the Knights Templar outside of France, which could have allowed the Templars to continue to exist in secret, and this secrecy may have ultimately been what influenced Masonry's secrecy, and it attaches them to the Masonic tradition in this particular way. Perhaps, the theory goes, hidden Knights Templar ended up ultimately joining Masonic groups or stone guilds during this time as a way of hiding from the church. And the reason they would have had these skills or being allowed to enter into stonemasonry is either through the idea that they would have had Masonic skills through working at the temple, which is unlikely given the fact that some of them would have probably never been to Jerusalem in their lives, or the idea is that the Freemasons would have simply accepted them through this idea that they were protectors of those running from injustice and that they were brothers in Christ, because again, everybody is Catholic at this point in history. Regardless of how the commandery degrees end up with us, there is clear evidence of Templars within England. You can see this in Roslin Chapel and various other headquarters that the Knights used within their time active within the United Kingdom. But this brings us to another question. Why is Freemasonry so secret? Well, as I explained before, a lot of it has to do with how we look at initiation, and it also has to do with the fact that a lot of the ideas that we discussed were very much not what many leaders at this time wanted to hear, considering that we espoused a lot of egalitarian ideas and weren't particularly denominational with our religious choice. That didn't work in ancient Europe, or when I say ancient Europe, I do mean Middle Ages, but my God, they were backwards as heck. However, there have been many countries that have supported us. Many kings have in fact joined Freemasonry. It's one of the hallmarks of the order. We think it's one of the things that makes us pretty impressive. And we're not impressed that kings join us. What we're impressed by is the fact that it really shows that the order does what it's trying to do. It's bringing all different types of people together. It's making this real attempt to make a brotherhood of mankind, which is something that Masons try to achieve. Finally, what about the myths that say that Freemasonry is even older than all of this or is attached to some of the greater legends about the world? Well, let me say a little bit about that, and one of them takes us to a place that we all like to get to eventually when we're talking about crazy mythological things, and that's Atlantis. One of the beliefs that a lot of people tend to have if they tend to believe in lost civilizations, or Atlantis in particular, is that humanity was once greater, technologically at least, than it is right now. Nowhere in Freemasonry is this claim made, but there are many Masons who believe it or who wish it was true, and the reason that they believe this is because there's something about Freemasonry that implies that we've always been at the forefront of the cutting edge. There are also many histories that say that we are connected at least to ancient Egypt, and one of them is the Regis poem, which is one of the old charges of Freemasonry. It dates to about the 13th to 15th century, it depends on who's doing the dating, and it claims that Freemasonry came to England in the rule of King Athelstan, amongst other things. It also claims that it's a product of Euclid, and that Euclid originally got it from Egypt, and if all of those things are true, that implies so much. If even half of the implications within the Regis poem are true, it would imply that Freemasonry is one of the most ancient societies on the planet that has always been there, that it's always been doing what it's doing, and perhaps is part of a greater network of societies that is trying to actively make the world a better place. Now, saying all of this about wanting to change the world brings me to a question, or at least an accusation, which is Freemasonry satanic? And no, it is not. We don't have an official religious creed. Most of the members that I know happen to be active Christians and members of their church. When I say that we are trying to make the world a better place, I'd like to give you an example by talking about something that a lot of people don't know is connected to Freemasonry, and that's Shriners Hospital for Children. Shriners International, which funds Shriners Hospital for Children, does a lot of really good work. One of the things that they do is they provide free children's hospitals to people all the way up to 24 years of age, and they do this at cost to themselves so that kids can have free medical care. They do that because they want to help children, and that's the only reason that they do it. There's no other sinister intent. Furthermore, my lodge gives a lot to local charities, and we also try to give donations to our local public schools. Other Masonic lodges do similar things. That's what we mean when we're charitable and we want to help. If we happen to be rather well connected and are trying to change the world, do we secretly control it? No, we don't, and let me explain why. If you want to believe that any particular group controls the world, or if you're a conspiracist, let me tell you what's really going on in your head, and you can probably hate me for it if you want to. You, instead of going to church or getting a real hobby, have decided that this big scary world that might ultimately not have a plan behind it is too terrifying to deal with as an adult, so you've decided to invent a conspiracy which, even though it's insane, is comforting to you because it gives an explanation for why everything happens. And in a sort of reversely arrogant way, your ego can claim to know why everything happens, and you have secret knowledge that you magically gained by Googling, and you somehow don't see how that's ridiculous. However, people who fall into this category are also those who would probably really want to discover the lost city of Atlantis and then would fail to do so. They're the type of people who wouldn't really be qualified for Freemasonry because, although they claim to be seeking truth and greater light, are just sticking their head into the sand and claiming enlightenment. Now, that's really all I have to say or want to say about conspiracies and Freemasonry. If that's something you're into, this is probably not the channel for you. But when it comes to Freemasonry, I think I've said all I want to when I am going to introduce somebody to the topic. If you have any further questions, leave them down below and there might be a follow-up episode. If you have any comments, leave them down there likewise. Thank you so very much for watching. As always, I couldn't do this without you. Your likes, shares, and subscribes keep the channel going. On Friday the 13th of next month, I'll be releasing my episode on the Knights Templar because I think it's appropriate to do it at least somewhat close to the day that they had their great comeuppance, at least as the Catholic Church would see it. And we'll explore what happened to them, what's going on, and what their Masonic connection is in greater detail there. That episode is part of a suggestion that I got in the comments, so if you would like me to make an episode that is tailored to your particular occult liking, please suggest it. It's already produced 2 episodes, the first being the Discordian one, and like I said, the next one being the Templar episode. Oh, and if you want to hear me talk, I have a confirmed lecture on, again, Oaths and Covenants at Garden Grove Lodge. The date for that is September the 24th. We have dinner at 6:30 and I begin my lecture at 7:30. If you need directions, I'll leave them below in the description, along with any of the books or works that I've mentioned within this talk. If you would like to book me for a lecture, workshop, or retreat, you can do so at www.enplectures.com. Let me take this final opportunity to say thank you again for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe and please give me a like and share as well. This has been Emiliano Noriega Petty with Past, Present, and Occult. I'll see you all next time.